Right, in Tucson, Arizona, there's a place called the Colibrí Center that helps identify human remains from people who died trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. And joining us today with us is Chelsea Halstead. She's the program manager at the Colibrí Center. She's in Arizona. Hi, Chelsea. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Please, it's a pleasure. Chelsea, could you please tell us a little bit about how you guys work? Because I know that you identify the bodies of the people who died trying to cross from Mexico to the U.S. But I know it's not as simple as identifying them. There's a whole forensic process that you have to go through. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. And to clarify, we're a nonprofit. We're located within a county medical examiner's office. So within that office, they're actually the ones who are responsible for identification. We aid in that identification effort by collecting information on missing persons and helping the medical examiner to conduct comparisons between the unidentified decedents that they have there in their office and the people that go missing while crossing the border. So ultimately, positive identification is really left to the forensic professionals. You can think of Colibrí as a crisis response center. It's basically a family response center within the medical examiner's office, and we're there to support the efforts of the medical examiner.
So you help gather information, or I assume that you take DNA samples from family members of those who have been missing, right?
It's very complicated. DNA actually in the United States, there's a system that doesn't allow people who are not law enforcement officers to take DNA. So that makes things a little complicated for us. As you can imagine, this population either lives outside of the United States, right, or they might be living in the United States undocumented. So that illustrates the need for an organization like Colibrí, because people cannot go to the police to report somebody missing, and that's why they come to us. We're working on improving the DNA situation, but right now, the ways in which we try and make a link to identify someone is usually off of things as simple as the clothes that somebody might be wearing when they cross, the jewelry that they might have on them, their personal effects, their dental condition, that sort of thing. So what our role is to try and find some sort of link that might make us take a second look between a set of remains and a missing person.
Right. How many cases do the authorities have to deal with every year? I mean, not just in Arizona, but all over the U.S.-Mexico border. How many people go missing every year? Do you have any idea of those statistics?
Those statistics are unknown. We're working on compiling that information currently, but what we do know is that it's thousands and thousands of people. The problem is that there's no kind of unified procedure for counting how many migrants go missing, right, and how many migrants die, because a lot of medical examiners' offices don't actually count migrant deaths as you would homicides or suicides or other kinds of metrics. Right. The office where we're situated actually is one of the few along the border that actually does keep metrics on that. So I can tell you that in the Pima County office of the medical examiner, they've had almost 2,500 deaths in the past 15 or so years.
2,500 deaths. Wow.
And out of those, about 900 people remain unidentified. So that kind of illustrates to you the crisis that we're facing in terms of an incredible number of missing people, but also an incredible number of unidentified remains.
That's an astounding number. How many cases have you been able to, or how many bodies have you helped identify? And how long have you been active as a group?
So Robin Reinecke, our founder, has been active since the year 2006, but she was operating kind of a solo project, and so as a nonprofit, we're about a year old. We're very young, okay, but we have almost a decade of experience behind us working with the medical examiner's office as a missing migrant project.
And so how many people have you helped identify in that time?
That's also a difficult metric. The medical examiner's office identifies about 2/3 of all cases of migrant decedents. And Colibrí has a hand in a lot of those identifications. We're working on getting better metrics for that.
Right. Do you get any kind of government funding?
We do not. We will not accept government funding.
You do
it's
not
really
accept
important.
It. Right.
It's important for us. Well, it hasn't been offered yet either, as you can imagine. But it's important for us to remain separate from the government because of the sensitive nature of undocumented migrants living in the United States.
Correct.
It's important that they're able to trust us and speak to us and report their missing loved ones without fear that we might be solicited by some government agency to give up our records or hand over some information about people. So it's very important to us to remain separate from the government.
What kind of area do you cover? Because I imagine that you don't just cover Arizona, right? Do you cover the whole U.S. border?
Yes, so we take missing persons reports for the whole U.S.-Mexico border. In terms of decedents, because we're only in one medical examiner's office along the border, we usually only deal with decedents from Arizona, but we're actually in the process of developing a regional database that will be the first kind of centralized effort at putting all of the information of the missing in the same place as the information for the unidentified dead. Because right now, there's a huge issue with decentralization. So we have information about the missing on this side, and we have information about the dead on this side, and they're not being
aware of what's happening, of what's been happening recently in the U.S.-Mexico border. There's an immigration crisis. Have you noticed things taking a turn for the worst? Have things remained the same? Are more people missing every year? What's your perception from where you are?
So, from our perspective, especially in terms of the children, we haven't seen a very high number of children crossing, or an increased number, I should say, in the Arizona sector. But I can say that in the past decade or so, we've had 72 minors who've died.
Wow.
So it's usually about 1 or 2 a year.
Right.
In terms of the way that immigration is being perceived in the United States and the way that it's changing, what I can say is that what we're seeing is that less people are crossing the border, but a higher percentage of them are actually dying.
Wow.
So what's happening there is we have a deadlier border.
I mean, what are some of the conditions that someone has to go through in order to traverse the desert and reach the U.S. border? I mean, the temperatures are harrowing, and there's no town or village for hundreds of miles, is it?
I would say thousands of square miles.
Wow.
What's important to keep in mind is that already by the time somebody has reached the U.S.-Mexico border, they've migrated through Mexico, which is an extremely dangerous journey. They're riding on tops of trains. They're dealing with criminal gangs. They might have been raped or robbed. By the time they reach the U.S.-Mexico border, a lot of migrants are not in good shape. And when they cross, there's often a lot of misinformation that gets spread around. So they might be told that it's a 1 or 2 day walk, but we've encountered people who had crossed and were out there for 3 weeks. In the Sonoran Desert, it regularly reaches triple-digit degrees in Fahrenheit.
Wow.
And it's incredibly remote, incredibly isolated, and it's actually physically impossible to carry enough water to keep hydrated. So there's a lot of different humanitarian groups that actually go out and leave water in the desert for migrants to find, because there's just no way that anybody who's out there isn't already dehydrated and in a really serious health condition.
All right, so reaching the other side is basically nothing short of a miracle. I'd like to thank you for being with us today. It's an impressive work that you're doing there in Arizona, so thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.